All right. It is 3:54 Eastern time, which means it is, am I right? 12:54 Pacific time. Oh, you're welcome, Carla. Thank you for being with us today. Okay. I'm going to get us started so that we can have our speakers begin exactly at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Tracy Gray, and I am founder and president of the Sankofa Global Project. Welcome to the Keynote Black History Month address, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. I just want to give you a heads up that throughout the program, we will read several quotes from the book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, which was the last book written, yep, thank you, Michelle, by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this is the first quote of the day. The deep rumbling of discontent that we hear today is the thunder of disinherited masses, rising from dungeons of oppression to the bright hills of freedom, end quote. I'm super excited to acknowledge that our sponsor, Greystar Real Estate, is here with us. I'm excited that in December 2020, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee from Greystar learned about our Racial Equity and Justice Initiative and reached out to us to figure out how we could partner. They were in the midst of planning their own Black History Month projects, and we were honored to partner with them to make that happen. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists and our representative from Greystar. I'll start with Derek Buckman, who is the Diversity, Equity, and Community leader from Greystar Real Estate's California division. We've got Karen Valentia Clopton, who is the San Francisco Human Rights Commissioner, and congratulations are in order for her as she was elected the chair of the Human Rights Commission this month in January 2014. So bravo for that. Thank you for being here. We also have Michelle Grant Groves, who is the executive director of the Center of Gravity and the I3 Institute. She is an educator and an equity advocate and one of my very good friends and partners in making sure that there is equity and justice for all. And a special shout out, Dr. Darin Gray is my brother and my silent partner in every venture that I take part in and create. So if you ever see any project that I'm doing, know that my brother is the silent voice behind everything that I do. And he's always been my champion and one of my very, very best friends. And so I'm grateful that he's here. My brother Darin is a brilliant person in his own right. He is a biomedical electrical engineer, a mathematician, an educator, and a cybersecurity expert with lots of degrees and still on his quest for lifelong learning. And joining us shortly will be Eljoy Williams, a social justice advocate, a political strategist, and the host of Sunday Civics and chair of Higher Heights. Oh, Joy's here. I didn't see you here, Joy. Oh, wow, there you are. Okay, thank you for being here. So I am, let me make sure I have everybody here. Okay, great. Eljoy is here. And then we have Richard Burton, who is the digital strategist and MC for today's event. Richard is monitoring the Zoom and the YouTube chat for comments and questions. And, oh, okay, thanks, Eljoy. We're excited to have this time together, and it's at 3:58, and we're on perfect timing. Each speaker will address specific chapters from the book. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community? The first chapter will be Dr. Clopton, Commissioner Clopton, Where Are We? Then we're going to hear from Michelle Grant Groves around racism and the white backlash. Then we'll hear from Dr. Gray, the dilemma of Black people in America. And then we'll hear from Eljoy Williams talking about Black power, politics, and policy. And then we'll close out with Derek Buckman with Where Are We Going? Where are we going? Where are we going from here? Okay. So I'm going to start with you, Commissioner Clopton. Dr. King wrote, in order to answer the question, where do we go from here, which is our theme, we must first honestly answer and recognize where we are now. So I'm going to turn it over to you. You're on mute.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for this opportunity. Where are we now? Well, how did we get to the place we are? So I'll be talking about Black history, which is really American history. Carter G. Woodson chose February, not because it was the shortest month of the year, because Black History Month began as a week. Because of both Abraham Lincoln's birthday and Frederick Douglass's chosen birthday in February. While I have a mere 10 minutes to describe 500 years of American legal history that reveal why African-American wealth and health disparities exist and are tied to government rules, regulations, and laws. So I'll begin where we began in school, 1492, which is taught in American primary school education as the year Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It is notable because the age of discovery brought Europeans to lands that were already inhabited. So at this point, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we are here in San Francisco. We are residing on the unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. This was the beginning of the dehumanization of non-Europeans to justify plunder and rape and colonization, including by papal decree for Christian domination and superiority over those deemed savages. While 1619 is an important date, Juan Guerrero is the first documented Black person to arrive in the Americas, in Florida, with Ponce de Leon in 1513. So we've been here a long time. And we started out, yes, 1619, there's all kinds of descriptions, whether they were enslaved Black people or indentured servants. What exactly were they? In 1619, it was the arrival of the first who were in servitude. However, they were treated very similarly to the Irish and Scottish indentured servants until 1640. So in 1640, 3 indentured servants escaped, were captured, and tried. And the 2 white ones were their servitudes, their indentures were extended by several years. However, John Punch, the Black servant, was sentenced to a life of servitude. And that was the first time that we're talking about lifelong servitude. In 1662, Virginia passed the matrilineal enslavement codes. and that passes bondage down from the mother to the children. And that was the beginning of very ugly, right? But in 1662, there were also uprisings, coalitions between white indentured servants and Black enslaved people. And the compromise was to change the indentures of the whites and make servitude based on color. In 1705, Virginia codified the slave code. And then in 1715, Britain entered into what is called the Asiento, which was basically they contracted out the slave trade to Britain for 30 years. They had an exclusive contract, and that made Great Britain wealthy. I'm glad that in the UK, they're starting to really look at where their wealth came from. And then, of course, famously in 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence, declaring all men are created equal. Around the same time Jefferson wrote the Declaration, he also wrote notes on Virginia, where he, for the first time, posited that Blacks were inferior beings, thus dehumanizing Black people. And then, of course, the infamous constitutional compromise declaring that enslaved Blacks were 3/5 human beings. In 1793, Congress passed the first Fugitive Slave Act. This is relevant because all of this leads up to, of course, where we are today with mass incarceration. In 1857, Dred Scott versus Sanford, the US Supreme Court ruled that Blacks were not citizens. Now, after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment allegedly abolished slavery, except as a punishment for a crime. Well, I think we all know what that meant. It immediately began the re-enslavement of Black people through convict leasing to plantations, the railroads, and US Steel. So Black men were arrested for being unemployed, loitering, being outside. Does this sound familiar about today when Black men are arrested, when Black people are arrested and harassed by police for merely living? This contracting out of convicted labor to work as forced labor is still going on today. They're not in prison bodybuilding, despite what movies might tell you. They are making everything from computers to furniture. And the Jim Crow laws, which we're all familiar with, were instituted to enforce segregation and maintain impoverishment in order to ensure cheap and available labor. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the United States Supreme Court found separate but equal was fine, paving the way for further dehumanization of Black people. By the 1930s and the New Deal, all those wonderful social safety net laws were written expressly to exclude Black people, excluding domestic workers and discriminating against Black people. During World War II, over 1 million African-American GIs served, including the famous Tuskegee Airmen. However, when they returned after the war, they were not included in the largesse of the GI Bill that provided home ownership, loans, assistance, and college educations to millions of white GIs returning from the war. In fact, the Federal Housing Administration, founded as part of the New Deal in 1934, changed the way families purchased homes by insuring mortgages for private lenders. Houses were purchased prior to that with 50% down or more prior to the FHA. Afterwards, home buyers only had to put down 10%, and some of the GIs returning had zero down, and the rest was amortized over 25 to 30 years, increasing home ownership in the US from under 40% in the 1930s to almost 70% by 2005. After World War II, housing developments were built and financed through the FHA, and they were segregated. Mortgage guarantees were redlined. So what is redlining? I'm going to ask you to look it up because I only have a couple of minutes. So, okay, but the redlining was to keep Black families in certain areas, and white families and white builders built outside of those areas. And that's the development of suburbia. So the redlining kept Black families from owning homes and in white developments. The white developments were restricted by law. They were restricted in their deeds. The racial covenants, all mandated by the federal government, all mandated by the federal government. I repeat that because I think a lot of people don't understand it. It is true that realtors, developers, banks, mortgage lenders, appraisers, all followed the FHA redlining guidelines, enforcing segregation. And that was true until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But really, at that point, it was too late. Housing patterns were set. We live in segregation today, and that is why. In addition, the anti-miscegenation laws had criminalized interracial marriage. And despite Brown versus Board of Education desegregating public schools, schools have remained segregated. And how? Through charter schools, vouchers, parochial schools, private schools, independent schools, and homeschooling. So in a nutshell, the criminalization of Black people, mass incarceration to continue to provide forced labor, as well as now supporting the prison industrial complex, the inability to build equity and wealth for generations has created a wealth and education gap between white and Black Americans that will continue apace without radical reparations, self-determination, and drastic legislative and legal changes. We have a lot of work to do, but that is where we are. We imprison 25% of all imprisoned people in the world are in the United States, while we're only 5% of the population.
Wow.
So, yes. So I'm happy to begin the conversation on such a high note. However, one of the reasons during Black History Month, we laud excellence and people who have excelled and achieved. It's despite all of what I just described, because this ongoing legacy of lies, many lies that have been told. We're all discussing the big lie of late, but the lie is, first of all, how was America founded? It was founded based on stolen land and forced labor. And we all are still dealing with that fact. So
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Clopton. That was a very, very concise summation of history of America that I believe all of us will be able to grasp some tools from and grasp some tenets, and that we can refer back to it. This podcast or this webinar is being recorded, and so folks will have an opportunity to listen to what you've had to say again. So I'm going to transition over to you, Michelle Grant Groves. I'm going to start with this quote. Racial understanding is not something that we find, but something that we must create.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Folks, can you see my screen here?
Yes.
This popping up. All right. The only reason why I have slides, Karen, you did, Commissioner Clopton, you did an amazing job in 10 minutes. I have my screen up just to try to cover as much ground as we can in the 10 minutes that we have. And Darin, thank you so much for being in conversation with me today, and to all of our participants for carving out and protecting this time, and Derek for your organization for helping make this possible. In these next 10 minutes, I think part of what I'm hoping to convey to our participants, particularly to our non-Black participants and all of my white folks out there, we have a heavy, high road ahead of us. And really at this point in history, the deeper work to dismantle racism, to unpack white privilege, and to build true and authentic action-oriented allyship, the burden of that work is on us. This is our work. Your Black and brown brothers and sisters and cousins and neighbors and friends, they're exhausted folks. And if the only thing that we as white folks in particular have to give up is our comfort, then it is well past time for us to learn how to grow more comfortable with the discomfort of dismantling the historic repercussions and ripple effects and current tsunamis and earthquakes and natural disasters that we are experiencing in our social, political, and educational lives. So using Dr. King's book on chaos or community on this chapter on the white backlash, I think just in the title alone, let's choose community, right? Let's take the chaos, the historical chaos that Karen did a great job on just giving us some broad brushstrokes of the history of how we got here today. I'll speak for myself. Growing up in the 70s and 80s in Santa Cruz County, and then living in San Francisco for 20-something years, the way society would have us believe is that racism happened in the Wayback Machine. Right? But when you look at this book alone being written in 1968, and you think about just movies that were 10, 11 years ago, it is not the Wayback Machine that we are talking about, and that what we are watching and witnessing and living through today is giving us yet another wave of moral and ethical responsibility and urgency for us to take up the work together and to do our lion's share of the work on making visible to ourselves and to others what everybody else can see when it comes to oppression, exclusion, and just the awfulness of the legacies that we continue to live with today because of the history that Karen shared. What would like to try to anchor this little portion of the conversation onto is giving you a very brief, very quick definition of racism, white privilege and allyship, and giving you some tips and strategies and resources to walk out on the other side of this conversation with. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do both the talking and sharing and post into the chat the resources that I have. So after I'm done, I'm going to go through into the chat and then give you some resources that I'm going to make reference to. But with that being said, let's just quickly, and the irony is there's nothing quick about this. There's nothing simple or easy about this, but racism really falls into three distinct categories, if you will. Number one, there's the outright and unapologetic racists. We all know who those folks are. They let us know right off the bat who we're working with and how they think and feel and how they operate in the world. Number 2 and 3 are more insidious. Number 2 are the resistant or avoidant folks. Nobody really wants to be racist. Now, mind you, we all got to see the unapologetic folks who had the 6 million weren't enough t-shirts and the Confederate flags running through the Capitol on January 6th. Those are our unapologetic folks. They showed us right off the bat who they are. Number 2 and 3 are, I'm colorblind. I love everybody. All lives matter, right? You don't want to be racist, but friends, you make comments like that, and you've got some deeper work to do. And then there's number 3 of folks who are willing to talk about race, willing to engage, or sit quietly while folks are having courageous conversations around them, but they're not participating, nor are they or you interrupting the horribly racist comments or jokes when someone pulls up in a parking space and says something to your Black citizen next to you that they should not be saying, and you stay in your car and stay silent. You are a passive recipient of keeping the country comfortable with the racist overtones and undertones that exist in this country. So how do you interrupt it? How do you move out of being a passive recipient? How do you move out of saying, but I thought colorblind was a good thing? No, friend, that's not. We live in a very color saturated world, and this is your invitation and call to action to do better and be better, especially after the racial uprising that we are all experiencing after the George Floyd murders in June. Our Black and brown brothers and sisters, neighbors, friends, and cousins need us to show up very differently in this work. And this is your invitation to become part of a larger movement of modern abolitionism. And I'll go into that a little bit more in the comments. So I want to leave you with this quote following racism: when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. I want you just to sit with that for a second. Because if you think that it's already equal and people are saying, no, it's not, it's going to feel like you're being oppressed. And that's where this huge backlash from the white community, from those 1, 2, and 3 folks, particularly the 1 folks on that definition of racism that I just went over. Equality is going to feel like oppression if you already think that equality exists, and everybody else in the world who doesn't look like you or experience the world the way that you do is saying, ain't happening and hasn't ever been that way. So it's going to be uncomfortable work. It's necessary, just like when you're running up a hill or you're at the gym or you got a coach saying you can lift more weights, you are not enjoying yourself. You know on the other side of that there's going to be tremendous gain, but it is not comfortable work, and nor is this when we're talking about dismantling the physical, psychological, spiritual, economic, political, and educational oppressions that are still in play today here in this country. And by virtue of it being at play in this country, it's at play around the world. So what does it look like for white privilege? Or I'm sorry, for pro tips. So what can I do, Michelle? I need to do better at understanding racism. I need to do better. I don't want to be a racist. I don't want to be an active racist, obviously. And I don't want to be a passive racist. That sounds kind of icky to me too. Great. Please read. And these are just beginning tips, folks. This is the tip of the snow on the iceberg of opportunities that are out there for you. Read Tim Wise, great anti-racist speaker. He wrote a book called White Like Me. It's a great place to start if you want to hear from an active anti-racist ally. Read Ijeoma Olau's book. I have it back here behind me, so you want to talk about race. It's a great starting book. It's more like having a conversation with the author. She does a great job. And in the comments, I will read some Business Insider, diversity, equity, and inclusion resources. They've got about 22 different books that you can pick and choose from to read. But it starts with educating yourself. Please don't start with asking your Black friend. Please don't start by asking around the water cooler. I know Starbucks tried to have that conversation as you're getting your morning coffee. They tried. You're going to make some mistakes. It's okay. Ijeoma talks about that in her book of you're probably going to make some mistakes. It's how you fail fabulously. It's how you fall forward in this work. And just know that with grace and humility, that's where the bigger work is going to happen. But it starts with self-education and self-determination to do better, know better, be better and believe differently. White privilege is like this friend here in the fishbowl. Fish doesn't know it's in water, and the view that the fish has when looking through water and glass is distorted. Everybody else outside of the fishbowl has a very different perspective, and trying to convince the fish that they're swimming in water and that their view is distorted is going to be really hard, because all that fish knows is what they see, and that's their normal. The problem is with white privilege is that when you look at media, Disney, cartoons, movies, Hallmark Channel movies, everything that we see in our neural priming, as Dr. John Powell from Cal Berkeley talks about, is priming us for white-centric experiences, white-centric normalcy, not white-centric policies, as Ms. Clopton was, Commissioner Clopton was talking about. So we have to really do a deeper examination of those historical policies and practices and recognize history for the truth that it is. We also have to deeply examine our social values, perceptions, and beliefs in trusting others to have valid perspectives outside of our own, and getting outside of that white-centric, that white normal perspective, and say, wow, you know, if I were really to trust and believe that the water is there and that I'm in the fishbowl and that other people have a clear view of what's happening, the truth is I probably have a lot of unearned rights and privileges. And for folks like me, another time, another talk, I will share my personal testimony. It's not that we don't have hard lives. And trust and believe, and Tracy, I know you know our story, had a tough go. I am a survivor many times over, and I have not had an easy life. But me being white never got in the way of me having a hard time. In fact, me being white, looking the way that I do, showing up the way that I do, having the speech patterns that I've been socialized to have, having the command of the English language in the way that I do, has certainly fleeced my entire hard life's path in a way that many friends, family, neighbors, cousins, and brothers have not had to grapple with. In fact, I've been given a lot of help by many folks in order to be where I am today. So unearned rights and privileges, it's a real thing, folks. You got to look into it and you've got to examine it. And I want to invite you, if you're like, nah, I'm just here because somebody volunteered me into this talk, please start to volunteer yourself into examining self-doubt. Displace your perspective to consider that maybe other folks have a cornerstone on what truth is, and it's not just your way or the right way or the white way that's going to get us through into the future. So some quick pro tips here of unpacking the invisible knapsack. It's invisible to folks like me and you and white adjacent folks. And you've got to read a lot more to be able to see beyond the water. You've got to listen a lot more, and you've got to inquire with humility a lot more. And when I talk about inquiring with humility, yes, it's asking questions, but I used inquiry as a really, really purposeful, because sometimes when you ask questions, and white folks, I'm talking to you, it all of a sudden starts to feel like an interrogation. And you know the difference between being interrogated and somebody inquiring with humility and grace. So inquiry means I'm asking questions for my own benefit because I really don't know and I need to better understand. Interrogation is I have power over you and I'm going to ask you questions because I'm going to try to change your perspective through the conversation. So please do, as you're inquiring with humility, ask those questions for your own self-understanding, not to try to push at with your power of perspective at someone else. You're trying to increase, improve, and clarify your own perspective. Make sense? All right. Another quote that I love, one of my favorite t-shirts to rock, you can find these stickers and t-shirts online. Equal rights for others does not mean fewer rights for you, friends. It is not pie. If you don't have to give up your seat, you're going to go find one to make sure that someone else has a seat at the table. Please don't go trying to advocate for other folks at this point. Get out the way and let them speak for themselves. Use your privilege as a right and responsibility that you have, and say, hold on just a second, I got a friend here. Tracy, do you mind? Rather than trying to tell Tracy's story for her. Make room at the table, give space, and hand over that microphone. Build a bigger table. Go find the card table in the other room and make sure that there are chairs and tables for everyone, because it's always better when we share, and it's always better. And any innovator, any industry at this point knows that diversity is power. Derek, I see you nodding, that diversity of perspective, when y'all are hive minding and whatever it is that you do, where every voice has an opportunity, and that those disagreements in the debate actually lead to sparks of innovation and ideas. So embrace debate, embrace diversity, and remember, share that pie, please. There's plenty enough for everybody. When we're talking about allyship, we have to create brave and safe spaces. You want to be a strong ally, then you better put on your big panties and get real brave at saying whatever needs to be said. It means that when somebody's telling somebody something else that you overhear, they're saying, oh, you know what I mean. You say, I think I do know exactly what you mean. And I'm going to say that's not okay. That bothers me deeply, that you don't know who's in my family, and how dare you say something like that. So please, as an ally, learn and practice how to speak up, even if your voice shakes. And that this is a journey for life. So you're going to have to lean in, and that you don't get to arrive as a woke person. Guys, that's not a thing. It's not a thing. All right, that's not a thing. You don't just wake up and say, check, I've got my badge. I'm a woke white girl. No, you're not. I get checked all the time, and I have to be, and you have to be willing to lean in. For the rest of your life, you never fully arrive, especially as a white person who is trying to be an active and responsible ally in the work for racial justice, equity, and transformational change. So please be prepared to always see another stepping stone in front of you. Please be prepared to have a friend say, friend, we need to walk back a few steps because we need to have a different conversation. I think you forgot. It's not your turn to talk. So please, please, please think about some of these tips and strategies that we're giving you. Being a white ally requires white readers and white leaders to reflect on how they have benefited from racial privilege, and how their own assumptions and attitudes about race have absolutely shaped our thinking and interactions with people of color. And what that means for those of you who are wondering, tips how to respond to racism is dialogue, which means it's reciprocal, which means you're doing a lot of learning and listening, and that you're not just learning and listening and say, did that? No, friend, you got to get involved. And so find some local organizations, find some local agencies, find other folks like Sankofa Global Project, like those of us who are on the call today. But in addition to that, going to World Trust is a great place to start with Dr. Shakti Butler, looking up National Equity Project online, and of course, staying in touch with those of us who are on the call today, because the work doesn't just stop because you happen to do an hour of awesome with us. So please, today, as you're really thinking about the white backlash that we are watching right now, played in live time on all of our news channels, blogs, radios, social media channels, you've got to remember that if you want to be an anti-racist ally, that you want to work to actively seek to dismantle the historical structures that exist even today that are keeping others from truly experiencing racial equality, then you've got to get in the arena. You've got to be brave with your life, and you've got to show up, and you've got to take chances, and you've got to be willing to fail forward, and you've got to be able to be willing to flail a little bit and know that you're not alone, that there are many, many, many of us others who are out there in the world who are seeking to do the same. Darin, I don't know how I did on time, Trace. I don't have my time clock there. Darin, do you have a question for me or something to consider for you in the skin that you live in and where you're standing, for white folks and non-Black folks who want to show up as allies and be better and do different? Is there something you can think of for us to consider?
Well, I think you've covered a significant amount, and I think, I'm not sure, Tracy, are we behind on time?
We're good. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So, one of the things that I've noticed from a number of of my white allies is, even when they're in the space of support, oftentimes they lose track of who they're supporting, because it becomes this passion. And so it's like you said, making sure to allow people who need to give their voice that opportunity. I think that's important.
Thank you. Awesome.
Great. To be continued, I hope.
Thank you, Michelle. I think that was absolutely phenomenal. And I mean, if you wouldn't mind, I would love for you to share that, your presentation with me, maybe after this meeting. I'd love to give that to, our hands of our folks who are watching today. So we're kind of about halfway through today's event, and I have the pleasure to switch gears into our next chapter, which is the dilemma of Black people in America. So I'm going to read this quote from the book here. Freedom is not won by a passive acceptance of suffering. Freedom is won by a struggle against suffering. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Darin Gray to kind of summarize and talk about what that means.
Thanks, Derek. When you're talking about freedom, as a quick exercise, if people can write into the chat what they think it means to be free, because we say that word a lot, but what does it really mean to you? So just type it in the chat, 1 or 2 words. What does it mean to be free? Or a sentence, and we'll take about 30 seconds for people to do that. Not just the panelists.
Without fear to make decisions. Richard, can you read these?
Oh, no, I can see them as they're coming through.
Okay.
Actually, as they're coming through.
How to be active and ally, to be the person I want to be, having options, educated, the opportunity to make your own choices, unbound, authentic, safe, dignity, expression without fear, to live your truth without apology, to openly share, exist, grow, flourish as a community without limitations, biases, allowances, abilities to express the fullness of my God-given the talents and gifts without obstruction, ability and experience to be my own wild, weird, and wonderful self, power of choice without fear, to be able to do what I want, live the life I want, self-determination, and doing so without fear, for safety, to choose how I want to live, where I want to live, who I can love, can make choices and decisions without fear, all of the above, safety, make choices without fear. Yes.
Okay, great. So now I don't want you to write this in the chat, but I want you to think about in the inner cities across this country, for African-American boys and girls, what do you think they believe freedom means? So when you look at Maslow's hierarchy, everyone here is talking about self-actualization, right? The higher orders of things. But start to think, what does it mean to be free if you have food every day? Does it mean to be free if you're not afraid of being accosted on your way to the store by someone in authority or someone in your neighborhood? Mm-hmm. So when you talk about freedom, and Dr. King in the book, I believe people misunderstand or misinterpret, given our times that we have now, what he was talking about in terms of freedom. Because we're looking at this freedom from, the information age, from, the age of technological advancing, whereas the freedom to be able to walk across the George Pettus Bridge was something different back then. So I'll move on to the next one, community. And now you guys are probably gonna know what's next. What would you define as community? Pick any community that you're a part of. Any community, doesn't matter whether it's the African-American community, the LGBTQ community, if you're talking about the community of education, if you're in a fraternity or sorority, just pick a community and just say what your community is, the community you most identify with.
A place of love, support, and safety. People make the community. Family and friends. My own family, trust, place of understanding. Family, the place where I belong, the place where, because of who I am, not what I do, belong. Church community, family and close friends, vulnerability, LGBTQ friends, the people and places where I don't need to explain my identities to, family and friends, place where I feel loved and respected, connectedness, togetherness,
Okay, good, good. And I want you to do it again. I want you to think about those African-American boys and girls all across this country. What do you think, and don't put this in the chat, what do you think they understand community to be? Okay, so you probably know where this is going, economic empowerment. What does that mean? Is it college? Is it a trade school? Is it politics? Is it entrepreneurship? Is it knowledge? Is it generational? What would you say economic empowerment would be for your community? Any of the communities that you identify, what would that be for your community? And go ahead and type that in the chat. What economic empowerment would be for your community.
People who have something in common, a similar experience, outlook, career, geography, interest, unlimited resources. That's me, by the way. I believe in unlimited resources.
A little tougher question.
Financial stability, betterment, opportunity. Yeah, it is more difficult, definitely. To be able to pursue education, home ownership, education, abundance, legacy, resources for children and parents, resources and freedom to use it. Resources, healthy food, clean water, the list goes on. Financial empowerment, stability.
And you know where this is going.
Yes.
What do you think economic empowerment means for those African-American boys and girls across this country? Now, the reason I took you through this exercise was to give you perspective. You know, we oftentimes talk about, and even in the African-American community, we talk about how do we fix the Black community? How do we make it better? Well, we're not all speaking the same language. When I talk about freedom, it's the freedom to, during a pandemic, hang out with my grandkids and get my full paycheck. When I talk about community, I'm involved in multiple communities. There's my family community, my church community, there's the educated community, there's the STEM community. I have all these different communities of support. When I talk about economic empowerment, it's how much I have saved. It's my 403 because I work for a university instead of a 401. It's, you know, being able to also get Social Security. It's my pension from being a teacher. It's investments. It's all of these things. And so when you start looking at freedom not being passive, it is not won by passive acceptance of suffering, but by one against the struggle against suffering. Think about what all of these African-American young boys and girls are suffering with in terms of freedom, community, and economic empowerment. And then think about the person sitting next to you, the 50-year-old, the 60-year-old, the 70-year-old African-American, and realize that they were once that child. Yeah. That child that you're thinking about right now, that you have sympathy for, that your heart is worried about, that you're concerned about, that you're pained as I've taken you through this exercise. Think about the person who's sitting next to you at the light, in your gym, as you're at Starbucks, as you walk by the homeless person. They were once that child that you just a few moments ago had the utmost compassion, empathy, and desire to help. That person has been doing this, as Commissioner Clopton talks about, this goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And so if you want to help combat suffering, if you really want to help people of color to engage with freedom in African-American communities, then really start thinking about those children who are dealing with all of the things that we're dealing with now and have been dealing with historically, and offer some of that empathy, compassion, and support to the adults in your life.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gray, my brother, Dr. Gray. I appreciate your thoughts. And I'm so glad that you talked about, you know, COVID-19, the fact that we are all in a pandemic. We're all suffering through a pandemic. And that, you know, that there's a whole conversation that needs to be had about what can freedom mean for us going forward, if ever we make it through to the other side. But I think that, you know, your comments around making sure that we're thinking about each other from the perspective of children, it's amazing. I mean, there's that quote. I was a kindergarten teacher for many years. Everything I ever needed to know about how to deal with people, I learned in kindergarten. And so when we're thinking about socialization and how we work with one another, it's really to looking for the inner child and looking for our shared humanity and how we interact with one another. which leads me to this quote for L. Joy Williams to introduce her from Dr. King's book is, it's a quote, "A problem of power, a confrontation between the forces of power demanding change and the forces of power dedicated to the preserving of the status quo." Now, power, properly understood, is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social and political and economic change. Okay, I have to make sure it's in, oh, Eljoy can't get in. Let me fix this right now, Eljoy. My apologies for that. Okay, where are you? Okay. Yes, there we are. Okay, Eljoy, there you are. There we are. I apologize. I'm sorry I wasn't able to, I didn't realize you weren't able to get in.
No problem. I was just listening to everyone's actual presentation and discussion, so it was great to hear as everybody was, giving their own remarks. So I had the benefit of not being on camera the whole time.
Thank you. So Eljoy, I would love for you to talk about, and we can have a whole conversation about politics, policy, your role with Higher Heights of America, how important civic education and civic engagement is, since you are the host of Sunday Civics, and how we can envision, someone asked, please move the baby higher.
Yes.
We need to see the baby.
Oh. Well, she had her own talk. I don't know if everybody could hear her. She had her own 10 minutes to contribute to the conversation. It's our fault that we can't understand what it is.
Yes, yes. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Eljoy.
Well, thank you very much, Tracy, and thank you to all of the panelists who have gone before me, and really to talk a bit about, I guess, continuing the conversation about economic power that Dr. Gray was mentioning, and making the connection between political power as well, and talking about power in general. And, rereading Dr. King's piece in Chaos and Community, and particularly talking about the Black Power chapter. And I actually encourage everyone, if not going back and reading the entirety of the text, reading the chapter on Black Power specifically, and understand its correlation in terms of the current movements that we are experiencing at this time. The conversation, he opens up the chapter, particularly talking about the rise of the slogan Black Power. And he talks about having conversations with Stokely Carmichael and the other folks that were using the phrase, beginning to use the phrase, and talking about, from his perspective, as he perceived that it wasn't helpful to the movement. All right, so for those who's asking about what book, the actual title of the presentation is a book written by Dr. King, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And so Tracy, I'm sure we'll put that in the chat, but sort of the Black Power, even if you plan to read the entire book, I encourage you to, but really talking about this chapter on Black Power. And as I begin to talk about it, you can see the correlation of where we are in a current cycle of a movement today. As I mentioned, this was the time, the time frame that Stokely Carmichael and some other organizers, not just him, began to use the phrase Black Power, and it was controversial. People deemed it as a separatist talk, as not beneficial to the overall movement that was being built. And keep in mind, we refer to it as the civil rights movement now. That's not how it was referred to in the current context. And there have been many movements of civil rights in the context of our history. And so Dr. King himself brought Stokely Carmichael and a number of organizers who he had previously worked with to have a conversation about the use of the phrase.
Mm-hmm.
and how it was not beneficial to their overall movement, how the press would take the language of it, and the opponents would, our opponents in the movement would take the phrase and turn it against the organizers and people who were actually trying to achieve freedom and political and economic power. Now, for those who are paying attention to what movements are happening now, this is extremely similar in the same ways of talking about the phrase defund the police, right? And the conversation now is about whether or not that phrase, does it really mean that? Are you really talking about getting rid of police? Is this not helpful to our movement? And as Tracy knows, that even within the NAACP, in which I lead, even within the organization, you have people of other generations, talking about, well, I don't want to use that phrase because, we need public safety and things of that nature, rather than addressing the real positioning of the reason for using such a phrase. But I do find it further interesting, and as you will find it in reading as well, that while Dr. King opens the chapter talking about his personal belief on, what the phrase does to the overall movement, he spends the majority of the chapter talking about what the phrase Black Power encompasses, where it comes from, why it was necessary, and what the people, the organizers who are using it, where it comes from. So again, he lays the burden of this not on the organizers themselves. And while he has a disagreement of how the phrase is used, he is not laying the sole burden of changing something on the backs and on the shoulders of the actual organizers and of the actual people he is organizing with. Instead, he is giving a history and a context for people as, this is why people are using this phrase. This is what it actually means. Here is, how America contributes to this, how white people contribute to this, and sort of what Black people are actually seeking by saying this phrase. And I find that extremely important to do, particularly in the cycle of movements, and again, bringing it to the current conversation of even defund the police. I often tell people that are critics about the use of the phrase that I think they're spending more time on grammar and public relations than they are on the actual people behind, and the necessity behind using the phrase defund the police, right? So you end up spending more of that time. And so using Dr. King as a model, right, that he himself, while had disagreements about how a phrase was used, put majority of the burden on the system that needed to change and the people that needed to be changed, rather than the people who were experiencing the brunt of the racism and the discrimination and lack of power. And I think that's a really important point, that even if you have people amongst your family, amongst your friends and other leadership in that you're working with, is not so much to get caught up in the disagreement about what phrasing or terminology be used. Dr. King recognized that even while they may disagree on a particular phrase, at the end of the day, we're still together in the same mission of achieving the outcomes that we're both trying to achieve. So moving on and talking a bit more about the calculus of power. And he talks about in this chapter as well, talking about, we like to use the phrase, what is it, Tracy, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Like everybody likes throwing it out and putting it on PowerPoint presentations with little squiggly lines and everything. And we are taught that having power, particularly as people of color, as women, as any other marginalized groups, that having power is something inherently wrong, that you are supposed to, be discouraged, or you're discouraged from doing that. And instead, the lesson we get here is more talking about having power and doing something with it, having power through a justice lens, having power with the ability to address injustice, and the power to address communities and people of color and marginalized groups through love, is important. The only way that you can do that is by having power and sort of taking somebody else out of that position. And so building political power, which is something that in every movement of Black history, every civil rights movement, because there were many, every campaigns for justice and equity, of course, we know there are many, was about amassing Black power, Black political power, and Black economic power. And we do not need to shy away from that. In order to build community, you have to have power. You have to have political power, the ability to be able to determine who represents you, how resources are equitably distributed amongst your community, and then having the financial resources to be able to build up that infrastructure, right? So we see even after Reconstruction, where these people who were formerly enslaved, right, some of them who could not read or write themselves, were able to build infrastructure of education, right? Because they had the power that they had, the economic power that they had, scraping together pennies or dimes and the, benefactors of others, but they also had the power of their hands and their talent and their voice. By them voicing the, power in our voice as well, that I am going to build community. I am going to build infrastructure that even if I myself cannot read, even if I myself do not have the power, I know that I want to build infrastructure and community for future generations to also have. And the power of our voice, the power of our hands through being it trades, because as I remind people, a formerly enslaved didn't just have nothing. They also had they were iron workers. They knew how to work fields. They had all of that, right? So that using and toiling, being able to use things for their own development and power and building infrastructure, right? In order to amass all of that stuff, in order to build community. So you need the political power to be able to not only build, but then also protect what you build. And, Tracy has heard me say this so many times before within NAACP, when we use the phrase, when we're talking about the power of voting, and we use the phrase, oh, your ancestors died for your right to vote, is very simple to use, and quite often it's used as a negative to people as to why they don't vote. But I always encourage people to go further in that statement and in that history, that our ancestors knew that power of voting, and which was also tied to overall political power, was not just about being able to go in a booth and pick between choices that were already made for you. It was the power to be able to have voice and say in terms of how your community was structured, who had rule and representation over it. And then if you did not like them, if they were not protecting you, again, because this is a protection, that you had the ability and the voice and the power to be able to change that person. So not being able to have a sheriff, that if a community that you built is being terrorized by the KKK, being terrorized by racists or whatever, and the sheriff is not protecting you, that you have the power as a voter, as a community, to be able to vote that person out and put someone in that would protect your community, your resources, and obviously your family as well. So when we think about collective power in that sense, we are talking about building political power so that we have power as a group, building economic power, so the power to actually protect our resources, but also to be able to protect our families. And, going further into the discussion, there's a quote that sort of a number of quotes that sort of Dr. King sort of ties all of this in. He says, Black power at that time is a broad and positive meaning, a call to Black people to amass the political and economic strength to achieve these goals, right? So you need both political and economic power. And two, power in that sense was the ability to be able to push back, on things being created and controlled on our behalf or for us. And I think, going to Michelle's point earlier about how white people see themselves, or
I know folks have to go off, and I know Dr. Gray has to leave. I want to give Derek the opportunity to close us out. So Dr. Gray, I know you have to leave, so thank you for being here. So Derek, thank you, Eljoy. Thank you for that very, very comprehensive explanation of power. And so, Derek, can you close us out with what's happening, what's next with Greystar?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Tracy, Commissioner Clopton, Michelle, Dr. Gray, even though you're not here, Eljoy, and thank you to the entire Sankofa team for organizing such a powerful event today, and really just allowing me to be a fly on the wall has been kind of very much an honor. The sponsorship that we've established with Sankofa on today's discussion was built upon our organization's DEI framework, which encompasses awareness, enabling our team members to be great allies through awareness and education through events just like today, and also giving back, engaging our team members to advocate inclusive causes on behalf of Greystar. So in offering an opportunity for interested team members to listen in on today's conversation, we're providing an opportunity to listen to different people's perspectives surrounding social justice and equality issues, and also highlighting some of our efforts to give back locally. Speaking of giving back locally, a couple of our fundraising opportunities, we have them. They're for key organizations focused on creating equitable education opportunities for marginalized youth. Those organizations include the Kingmakers of Oakland and Ritter Elementary School. Yeah, I see Michelle waving some hands. I think you have some connections to the Kingmakers of Oakland. So how are we, what are our fundraising efforts look like? So first of all, we have our Black History Month t-shirts. We're commemorating Black History Month with a custom designed t-shirt, and a portion of these proceeds will go to support our fundraising efforts for the Kingmakers of Oakland, as well as Ritter Elementary School. I just got mine in the mail. This is what, oh, you can't see, oh, now you can. This is the shirt, the front and the back. I'm going to go ahead and drop the link in the chat for everybody as well. So if you haven't ordered your Black History Month t-shirt, feel free to do that. Yeah, when you can. Our deadline to order is going to be the end of this weekend. Also, Fridays in February, Casual for a Cause, wear jeans to work with a $5 donation to either the Kingmakers of Oakland and or Ritter Elementary School. So be sure to check in with your supervisor, make sure that you get the approval from them that you can wear denim, but that is also a cause that we're advocating for, to raise money for those organizations. A few upcoming events, Friday, February 5th at 2 p.m. and every Friday in February, we have our Black History Month book club, which is, we'll be unpacking Amber Cabral's incredible work, Allies and Advocates, creating an inclusive and equitable culture. So this week we're exploring what allyship and advocacy looks like in practice. So I think that really ties great into, Michelle, what you kind of gave us in terms of a prequel. Tuesday, February 16th, 1 p.m., we have our Black History Month panel loaded with great star-studded guests, including Carolyn Carter, Director of Customer Experience, John Little, Director of Enterprise, People and Culture, Jonathan Fern, Senior Director of Development, and Nelson Ford, Managing Director of Talent. This is also hosted by our lovely Keisha Fisher, Senior Director of Real Estate here in California. Wednesday, February 24th, 11 p.m., Unpacking Unconscious Bias. This event's hosted by Bill Walker. We'll facilitate a roundtable debrief on our unconscious bias, understanding unconscious bias to unleash potential. That's available to all of our Greystar team members in Workday. So finally, I want to give some acknowledgments to my own team. For the Black History Month Steering Committee, we have Keisha Fisher, Holly Longoria, Summer Perkins, Bridget Baker-Snyder, Eileen Nelson, Jonathan Rezenable, and Todd Kerr. Additional DEI leaders in our California division, Renee Rodriguez, Bill Walker, and of course, Bradley Johnson. Thank you all so much for everything that you do. Your work is incredibly impactful and powerful. And finally, thank you once again to Tracy for hosting such a wonderful event today and letting us be a part of it. Yes. Thank you.
So I want to give everyone a chance to say one last thing before we go. And I'm super excited that we were able to pull this together. And I look forward to this not just being one day, but that we'll be continuing to having conversations and making advocacy and active change as we move forward. Commissioner Clopton.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Derek from Greystar. I think it's very appropriate to be talking to a real estate organization about their historic role in creating wealth inequity in our United States. I wanted to just talk about 4 things that everyone can do. The first one is to educate yourself about your own background and take that DNA ancestry or 23andMe test so you know more about where you came from, and read about American history and your role in it, what your parents' role was, what your grandparents, how they impacted our history. And then second, to really reach out to other people, to people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, whether it's cooking different kinds of foods and experiencing other cultures. And right now, of course, we're doing that virtually. We're not traveling, but we can do that virtually. Third is really to make an effort that if you see something, say something, to really intervene when you see something. And then finally, we are the makers of history. So we are currently the makers of history. We saw what happened over the last 4 years when the racist genie decided, oh, we'll just be completely blatant about what we're doing. That's a good thing, because now we can talk about the reality. We can talk about not just our history of forced labor and stolen land, but what is our role in making a choice, our moral and ethical choice, to change the way things are, to make them the way that we moral and ethical people wish them to be. And that's investing in our communities.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Michelle? And then we'll close with Eljoy.
Do one thing different. The only way I think you can ultimately fail is to do absolutely nothing different today or tomorrow than when you came out of this call. So pick at least one thing. Pick 9, pick 17, but at least pick one that you say to yourself, as Commissioner Clopton was saying, that you're going to work on you, that you're going to take away and do different. Whatever that is, do at least one thing different to shift outcomes for kids, family, community, and for yourself.
Eljoy? You're on mute.
Thanks so much. And thanks again for inviting me. The final thing I would like to say is that in the rest of this month and in this season of Black History Month, that Black history isn't just Dr. King, Malcolm X, and Fannie Lou Hamer. That we as Black families, as Black people, make Black history every day, and we have Black history within our own family. So something that I encourage all folks to do is one, if you and your family are Black, is to tell your family story to your own family. Because we take for granted that everybody knows where grandma and them migrated from, what they did for a living, how they participated in the great collective story of people of African descent in this country. So it's not just about celebrating, the heroes and the individual people that we know of prominence. It's also about celebrating our own family's history in the people of African descent in this country as well. So identify a date on the calendar for you and your family to get together. And this time it could be on Zoom, just like Thanksgiving or Christmas we did, and have a conversation, share the story of your own family's history in this great experiment of democracy. The second thing I would say to people who do not identify as Black is to also tell your family story and whole truth about their connection to and participation in people of African descent in this country as well. African American history is American history. And so telling the truth and telling the story of your own family and its connection to these other pivotal points is really important as well. So I think those are things that I would suggest that people do every time to make sure that your family story continues on.
Thank you. So I thank you all for being here. I dropped in the chat a 28-day challenge. My daughter and I created something so that people can work together to teach themselves Black history, their own history. And as we close out, I want to encourage all of us to seek truth, which can lead to reparations, which is to prepare. Thank you, Michelle, for that. And then to reconciliation. And that we all have the opportunity, we have the responsibility to make sure that we are all full citizens and that we are all able to live equitable lives in this country. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Excellent.